At my graduation dinner, I thought the applause was for me, until Mom said, "We're just so proud of Noah for turning his life around." My brother had just gotten out of jail. Then Dad handed him a car key and said, "This is yours now. You deserve it more than anyone." I just sat there, holding the bill I'd paid for their mortgage, their groceries, and his legal fees. I didn't argue. I just smiled. Because 2 days ago, I called someone they forgot even existed, and tonight, she's landing at the airport with a copy of the deed. I, 29M, graduated from law school 3 days ago. Top 5% of my class. Full scholarship. Job lined up at a prestigious firm starting Monday. But as I sat at the graduation dinner I'd organized and paid for, watching my family celebrate my brother instead of me, I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. The restaurant was nice. Not fancy, but nice enough that the bill would hurt most families. Not us, though, because for the past 4 years, I'd been paying for everything. Mom's arthritis medication, Dad's truck payment, the mortgage on the house I'd never live in again, Noah's legal fees when he got arrested for possession with intent to distribute, the commissary money during his 8-month stint in county jail. All of it. Noah had been out for exactly 6 days when I graduated. 6 days of my parents treating him like he'd returned from war instead of prison. 6 days of hearing how proud they were that he was getting his life together while I studied 18 hours a day to maintain my scholarship. The applause started the moment we sat down. I thought it was for me. Foolish, I know now. Mom stood up first, her eyes wet with tears, and announced how incredibly proud they were. My chest swelled for exactly 3 seconds before she continued. She was proud of Noah for turning his life around, for completing his GED in jail, for staying clean for 6 whole days. Dad nodded along, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a set of keys, the keys to the Honda Civic I'd been eyeing for months, saving every spare dollar from my part-time job at the law library. He slid them across the table to Noah, explaining that Noah deserved them more than anyone, that he needed reliable transportation to get back on his feet. I sat there holding the receipt from that morning, the final payment on their mortgage, $2,347 that cleaned out most of my savings. The same savings account I'd planned to use for a down payment on that Honda. The same account that had paid for Noah's lawyer when he swore he was innocent, then later when he decided to take a plea deal. Nobody mentioned my graduation. Nobody mentioned that I'd just completed something none of them had ever dreamed of achieving. The conversation revolved around Noah's recovery, his plans, his fresh start. I smiled and nodded and paid for dinner when the check came, just like I'd been doing for years. But 2 days before graduation, I made a phone call that changed everything. Grandmother Sarah had been written off by the family 15 years ago. Not dead, just persona non grata after she'd refused to enable my father's gambling addiction and my mother's prescription drug habit. They'd painted her as bitter, vindictive, selfish. I'd believed them because I was 14 and trusted my parents. What they'd forgotten was that Grandmother Sarah had paid for the house they were living in. Not a gift, a loan. A legal, documented loan with terms they'd agreed to in writing. A loan that had been in default for over 3 years. I found her phone number in my old contacts from before the family cut her off. The conversation was brief but illuminating. She'd been waiting years for someone to acknowledge what had happened. She'd kept every receipt, every record, every payment, or lack thereof. Sarah had followed my academic career from a distance. She knew about law school, about my scholarships, about my job prospects. She also knew exactly how much money I'd been sending home each month because she'd been watching the family's financial situation closely, hoping they'd eventually make good on their debt. She was already driving cross-country when I graduated. The timing wasn't coincidental. She'd been planning this for months, waiting for the right moment to collect what was owed to her. My call had simply confirmed that the moment had arrived. The next day, Saturday, the family celebrated Noah's 1-week sobriety milestone. They ordered pizza, on my credit card, naturally, and spent the evening making plans for his future. Trade school, maybe, or community college. Dad mentioned how Noah had always been smart, just needed the right opportunity. Mom talked about how much potential he'd always had. I listened from the kitchen while loading the dishwasher, wondering if they'd ever said similar things about me. The answer was probably yes, but I couldn't remember when. Sunday morning, Noah took his new car for a drive. He'd been gone less than an hour when he called, panicked. He'd been pulled over for speeding, and the officer had found a small bag of something in his pocket. He was calling from jail, again, asking for bail money. Again. Dad looked at me expectantly. Mom started crying. The bail was set at $5,000, money I technically had, but had earmarked for my security deposit on an apartment near my new job. I told them I'd figure something out and went to my room to pack. My flight to Chicago was in 12 hours, and I had no intention of posting Noah's bail. Instead, I transferred my remaining savings to a new account at a different bank and started making other calls. The first call was to my new employer, asking if they had any recommendations for apartments in the downtown area. The second was to a moving company, arranging for my belongings to be shipped from my small apartment across town. The third was to the credit card company, removing my parents as authorized users on all my accounts. The fourth call was to grandmother Sarah, confirming her arrival time and offering to pick her up from the airport. She declined the ride. She'd rented a car and would be driving directly to the house with the sheriff's deputy and a locksmith. The foreclosure paperwork had been filed 3 days ago. The family had until tomorrow to vacate the premises or pay the full amount owed, $63,000 in principal, plus 15 years of compound interest, penalty fees, and legal costs. Total, $97,000 for $112. I'd done the math. Even if I emptied every account, cashed out my small retirement fund, and borrowed against my future earnings, I couldn't cover half of it. More importantly, I realized I didn't want to. Monday morning arrived with unusual quiet in the house. Dad had driven Mom to the jail for Noah's arraignment, leaving me alone to wait for Sarah's arrival. I'd already loaded my car with the essentials and left my key on the kitchen counter with a note. The note was simple. I explained that I was starting my new job in Chicago and wouldn't be available to handle any more financial emergencies. I thanked them for the opportunities they'd given me and wished them luck with their fresh start. I didn't mention Sarah or the foreclosure. They'd figure that out soon enough. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they'd been celebrating Noah's fresh start, I'd been planning my own. Sarah arrived at 11:30 with a sheriff's deputy and 2 large men who introduced themselves as debt recovery specialists. She was smaller than I remembered, but her presence filled the room immediately. She handed me an envelope containing copies of all the loan documentation, court filings, and the final judgment. She also handed me something else, a cashier's check for $25,000. She'd been following my academic career more closely than I'd realized. This was what she called a signing bonus, money she'd set aside years ago in case any of her grandchildren ever accomplished something worth celebrating. Law school graduation, she felt, qualified. We didn't stay to watch the eviction process. Instead, Sarah drove me to the airport 3 hours early, and we spent the time talking about family, responsibility, and the difference between enabling and supporting. She told me about watching my father develop his gambling problem and my mother's increasing dependence on prescription medications. She tried to help initially, but every dollar she gave them went toward feeding their addictions rather than stabilizing their lives. The house loan had been a last attempt to provide them with security while requiring accountability. When they defaulted on the loan and then cut her out of the family rather than deal with their responsibilities, she'd realized that helping them meant something different than what she'd originally thought. The flight to Chicago gave me time to process what I'd done. I'd essentially orchestrated my family's financial collapse and walked away. Part of me felt guilty. Another part felt liberated. The largest part felt tired, exhausted from years of being the family's financial safety net, while receiving none of the recognition or support that came with being truly valued. Update 1. My first week in Chicago was surreal. The law firm was everything I'd hoped: challenging work, intelligent colleagues, actual respect for my education and abilities. The signing bonus from Sarah had allowed me to rent a furnished apartment in a decent neighborhood while I looked for something permanent. Thursday evening, my phone started ringing. Dad called first, screaming about betrayal and abandonment. He'd found out about my connection to Sarah's sudden reappearance and was convinced I'd orchestrated the whole thing. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't seeing the bigger picture. He demanded that I fix the situation, that I find a way to pay off the loan or convince Sarah to give them more time. I listened to his rant without interrupting, then calmly explained that I was no longer in a position to handle their financial problems. When he started threatening to disown me, I reminded him that he'd already chosen which son deserved his attention and resources. The conversation ended when he hung up on me. Mom called an hour later, crying and pleading. She'd found the receipts I'd left behind, copies of every payment I'd made on their behalf over the past 4 years. The total was staggering even to me when I saw it laid out: $47,916. She begged me to come home, to help them figure out a solution. She promised that things would be different, that they'd appreciate me more, that they'd never take me for granted again. The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but I'd learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and panic-driven promises. I told her I loved her, but that I couldn't continue being their financial solution. If they wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be based on something other than my ability to pay their bills. Noah called last, from jail again. His bail had been revoked after he'd tested positive for methamphetamines during his check-in with the pretrial officer. He was looking at serious prison time now: second offense, violation of probation, possession while on bail. He needed a lawyer, a good one, and those cost money he didn't have. He asked if I could help, just one more time. He swore he was going to get clean for real this time. That prison would be the wake-up call he needed. He promised to pay me back once he got out and found work. I wished him luck and hung up. Update 2. 3 weeks into my new life, Sarah called with an update. The family had been evicted and were staying with Mom's sister in a 2-bedroom trailer about an hour outside town. Dad had found part-time work at a warehouse. Mom was applying for disability benefits. Noah was still in jail awaiting trial. More interestingly, they'd been telling people I'd abandoned them in their time of need. The story, as Sarah heard it from mutual acquaintances, was that I'd gotten too good for my family and refused to help when they needed me most. No mention of the years of financial support, the paid legal fees, or the graduation dinner where they'd celebrated someone else's mediocrity instead of my achievement. Sarah had been correcting the narrative where appropriate, sharing documentation of the loan default and my payment history with anyone willing to listen. The family's reputation in their small community was shifting rapidly as the truth emerged. She also mentioned that she'd been contacted by a journalist writing a story about predatory lending practices who was interested in the family's situation as a case study. Not because of the loan, that had been legitimate and fair, but because of how families often sacrifice their highest-achieving members to enable their most problematic ones. I told Sarah I wasn't interested in publicity, but I appreciated her setting the record straight. My new life was taking shape quickly. The work was demanding but rewarding. My colleagues were impressed with my preparation and work ethic. I'd found a permanent apartment in a building with a gym and a decent coffee shop on the ground floor. For the first time in years, my bank account was growing instead of shrinking. More importantly, I was sleeping well. The constant anxiety about family crises had faded. My phone no longer felt like a weapon that could detonate at any moment with news of another emergency, requiring my immediate financial intervention. Update 3. 2 months after leaving, I received a letter from Mom. Not a call or a text, but an actual handwritten letter delivered through the mail. The return address was still my aunt's trailer park. The letter was different from her previous communications. No pleading, no demands, no promises that things would change if I'd just come back and help. Instead, it was what seemed like genuine acknowledgement of how they'd treated me. She wrote about finally understanding what I'd been carrying for the family, about going through old bank statements and receipts and realizing how much I'd sacrificed, about the phone calls from neighbors and friends who'd heard Sarah's version of events and wanted to know if it was true. She admitted that they'd taken me for granted, that they'd seen my success as something that belonged to the whole family rather than something I'd earned individually. She acknowledged that the graduation dinner had been wrong, that they should have celebrated me instead of using my achievement as another opportunity to focus on Noah. Most surprisingly, she wrote about Noah's situation with what seemed like clarity for the first time in years. He was probably going to prison for at least 18 months, maybe longer. His public defender had explained that his pattern of behavior and violations meant he was unlikely to receive another chance at probation or treatment programs. She didn't ask me to help with legal fees or bail money. Instead, she asked if I'd be willing to talk to Noah before his sentencing, not to offer financial support, but to explain why I'd made the choices I'd made. She thought it might help him understand the consequences of his actions in a way that parental enabling never could. The letter ended with what felt like a genuine apology and a request that I consider rebuilding our relationship on different terms when I was ready. I kept the letter for a week before responding. My reply was brief but honest. I told her I appreciated her acknowledgement of what had happened, and that I was open to rebuilding our relationship gradually, with clear boundaries about financial issues. I agreed to write to Noah, but not to offer support for his legal situation. Instead, I wanted to explain how families can destroy their highest achievers by treating their success as a resource to be consumed rather than an accomplishment to be celebrated. Update 4. 6 months later. The letter to Noah turned into several letters, then occasional phone calls. He was serving 26 months in state prison and seemed genuinely interested in understanding what had gone wrong with our family dynamic. More importantly, he was starting to take responsibility for his choices rather than blaming circumstances or other people. Our conversations weren't about forgiveness or family reconciliation. Instead, they focused on patterns of behavior, enabling, and the difference between helping someone and allowing them to avoid consequences. Noah was intelligent. He'd always been intelligent, but he'd learned that his family would catch him every time he fell, which had removed any motivation to stop falling. Prison was teaching him what our family never had, that actions have consequences and that other people's resources aren't unlimited. Mom and I talked monthly now, cautiously rebuilding trust. She'd gotten a job at a grocery store and was working on her own recovery from prescription drug dependency. Dad was still struggling with gambling, but he was attending meetings and seemed committed to change. They'd moved into a small apartment and were paying their own bills for the first time in years. It was harder than they'd expected, but Mom admitted it felt better than constantly worrying about the next crisis or depending on my financial interventions. Sarah and I had dinner whenever she was in Chicago, which happened more often now that we had a relationship. She decided to use her real estate investments to establish a scholarship fund for students from dysfunctional families who were working their way through school. She asked me to help review applications and select recipients. The scholarship wasn't large, $5,000 per year, but it came with mentorship and a guarantee that the money was for education only, never to be redirected toward family emergencies or crises. Update 5. 1 year later. I got promoted to senior associate 6 months ahead of schedule. The cases I'd been assigned were complex and high profile, and my work had impressed both partners and clients. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase and a corner office with an actual view of the lake. More importantly, it came with respect. My colleagues valued my input, my analysis, my dedication. When I spoke in meetings, people listened. When I submitted briefs, they were read carefully and taken seriously. The contrast with my family dynamics was stark and illuminating. Noah was released early for good behavior and completed a mandatory drug treatment program. He moved to a different city, found work in construction, and started paying child support for a daughter he'd barely acknowledged before prison. We still exchanged letters occasionally, but our relationship was limited and conditional on his continued sobriety and personal accountability. Mom had been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store and was taking night classes to complete her GED. Dad was still struggling, but had gone almost 8 months without gambling. They'd started attending counseling together, working through decades of dysfunction and poor financial decisions. They'd asked about visiting me in Chicago, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Our relationship was improving, but it was still fragile and required careful boundaries. Having them in my space, seeing my success up close, might trigger old patterns of expectation and entitlement. Instead, we met halfway for lunch occasionally when I had business travel that took me through their area. These meetings were cordial but limited in scope. We talked about their jobs, their counseling, their gradual progress toward stability. We didn't discuss money, emergencies, or my career beyond general updates. The most profound change was internal. I'd stopped carrying their anxiety as my own. Their problems were their problems to solve. Their crises were their crises to handle. Their choices were their responsibility to own. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself rather than managing other people's dysfunction. The relief was overwhelming initially, then gradually became my normal state of being. Final update. 2 years later. The family had stabilized in ways I hadn't thought possible. Noah was engaged to a woman he'd met in his recovery program and was working steady construction jobs. Mom had been promoted again and was managing an entire grocery department. Dad had celebrated 1 year without gambling and was working full-time at the warehouse with benefits. They'd stopped asking me for money entirely. More than that, they'd started building an emergency fund of their own and had begun making plans that didn't involve external financial rescue. The most unexpected development was that they'd started helping other families in their community who were struggling with addiction and financial instability. Mom was volunteering with families affected by prescription drug abuse, and Dad was working with a gambling addiction support group. Noah was mentoring younger men in his recovery program, focusing particularly on those whose families had enabled their destructive behavior rather than requiring accountability. They'd learned something I'd been trying to teach them for years. Helping people sometimes means refusing to help them, and love sometimes means allowing someone to face the consequences of their choices. Sarah's scholarship program had expanded to support 12 students per year, and several of our early recipients had graduated and started careers. 2 were in law school, 1 was completing medical school, and another had started a nonprofit focused on financial literacy for low-income families. The program's success had attracted attention from other family foundations, and Sarah was consulting with them on designing support systems that empowered recipients rather than creating dependency. I'd been asked to speak at several law schools about overcoming family dysfunction to achieve academic success. These presentations were difficult but worthwhile. I met students who were struggling with similar dynamics and was able to offer practical advice about boundaries, financial independence, and the difference between family loyalty and family enabling. The most important lesson I shared was that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for dysfunctional family members is to stop solving their problems and allow them to develop their own capacity for responsibility and growth. My relationship with the family was cordial now, but it was also limited and conditional. We were friendly, but we weren't close. We were supportive, but we weren't financially entangled. We were family, but we were also individuals with separate lives and separate responsibilities. It wasn't the family relationship I'd imagined growing up, but it was healthier and more sustainable than what we'd had before. Most importantly, it was honest, based on genuine care rather than financial dependence, and on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. The revenge I'd planned hadn't been about destruction. It had been about liberation. Liberation from dysfunction, from enabling, from carrying other people's problems as my own. The best revenge against a family that had treated my success as their resource was to reclaim that success as exclusively mine and use it to build a life they couldn't diminish or consume. 2 years later, that life was everything I'd worked for and more than I'd dared to hope for when I was paying their bills with money I'd earned while they celebrated someone else's mediocrity. The applause at my graduation dinner had been for the wrong person, but it had taught me something valuable. I didn't need their recognition or appreciation to validate my achievements. I needed my own respect, my own standards, and my own definition of success. And I had all 3.